seriously. No problem with that. Just don't be obnoxious. Well, listen, I'm glad to be with you. I came to Christ in 1968 and was involved in an aggressive evangelistic ministry for several years. And I still do evangelism. In fact, I just returned about a week and a half ago from Rice University, which is a school in Houston, Texas. And I had a chance to address a crowd of about 300 students, most of them non-Christians, and then spent hours interacting with small groups of unbelievers and persuading them about Christ and so on. So I've done my fair share of street evangelism and street preaching and contact evangelism, and it's a good thing to do, and I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing. Let me just say something about Mormonism that I'm concerned about. I'm not an expert in Mormon ideology. I'm a philosopher, and I do think I have something to say about an aspect of Mormonism that I'll mention later. But if you think about the Jehovah's Witnesses, the idea of a Jehovah's Witness scholar is kind of like jumbo shrimp. It's an oxymoron. There are no Jehovah's Witness scholars, but there are Mormon scholars. All the cults. The only cult that actually has scholars on their side is the Mormon cult, the Mormon Church. And I use cult because we're here among friends, and I feel like I could probably use that here. I know it might not be the best term to use there. Just among us friends here. Several years ago, the Mormon Church intentionally adopted a strategy to take sharp young Mormon thinkers and send them to top doctoral programs around the country to get PhDs in philosophy and ancient Near Eastern studies in order to defend Mormonism. And as a result of that strategy, a small but not insignificant wave of young Mormon scholars emerged, centered at Brigham Young University and at other schools, in order to give a more robust defense of Mormonism. Now, as a result of this, evangelical cult apologetics, while helpful and an attempt to do your job, was really inadequate to address the new wave of Mormon scholarship. And so what we have tried to do in this book, The New Mormon Challenge, has been to try to address this new wave of Mormon thinking in an extremely robust, rigorous kind of way. And this book is going to cause a lot of problems. It is a very hard-hitting book. We're very charitable and gracious in the book. I think we're very kind and warm-hearted. We actually try to give Mormons a way out of all the things we press by saying maybe you could move over a little bit. So we're trying to nudge them down the road toward us a little bit rather than just hammer them. But it's a very hard-hitting book. And if you get it, you just need to be prepared for the fact that it is written at a scholarly academic level. It's not just another kind of street apologetics book. Now, having said that, I want to make clear that there's an important room for street apologetics and learning how to defend your faith in a very kind of street person-on-person basis that doesn't have to be scholarly. But I share this with you to let you know the location of that book and the overall strategy of the church, so that if you pick it up and you can't understand some of it, you won't get discouraged. Having said that, let me just remind you, I don't know what you've been taught and what you haven't, so let me just remind you that apologetics is a ministry of learning to help people understand why we believe what we believe. It is a way of helping people. It is not primarily about winning arguments. It does involve winning arguments, but not at all costs, and it doesn't involve being argumentative. You can learn to win arguments by learning to argue well, but that doesn't mean by learning to be overly aggressive or anything of that sort. And I think one of the best ways to defend your faith is to be a good listener, and if people interrupt you, then just tell them, please stop interrupting me. When you have something to say, you can call me on the table if I interrupt you. I'll do the best I can to listen. And after you've spoken, if you'd like, I'll paraphrase back to you what I've heard you say to make sure you understand it. But then I'd like the same privilege. And then you can actually have a conversation with somebody. But you have to So apologetics is learning to help people, and it's not just about winning arguments. Now, having said that, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about Mormon ontology, which is a Mormon view of reality. It's very interesting that the great theistic religions of Christianity and Islam and Judaism have serious differences with one another, but they at least agree that God and the human soul are not physical, and that there's more to reality than just physical reality. Mormonism is a materialist religion. Everything in the Mormon view of reality is composed of matter. There is nothing that exists that is not physical. And in Doctrine and Covenants, there's a passage in verse 131, 7 and 8 that says, "There is no such thing as immaterial substance or spirit. All spirit is matter, but it is more fine or pure and can only be discerned by purer eyes. We cannot see spirit matter, but when our bodies are purified, we will see that everything is matter." So according to Mormons, everything is composed of matter, including God and the soul. And nothing that is not composed of matter exists. Now, I want to try to lay this out for you in a little bit more detail, and then what I'd like to do is to explain to you why God can't be physical. And along the way, I'd like to try to say a little bit about what a spirit is, so that you can give a very simple definition of a spirit if you're called upon to do that. Now, it's going to look simple, but I'm going to have to unpack it here. All right, to begin with then, Mormons have a view of existence, what it is for something to exist. And I'm not sure the average Mormon that you talk to will know this, so I can't help you there. But I'd like for you to know about it. And according to the Mormon theory of existence, to exist is to be, number one, spatially extended. And located. Solid. And composed I'll just put another word in here, divisible. Now let's talk about that for just a minute. If something exists for a Mormon, the first thing that's got to be true of that object is it has to have spatial extension. That means it has to have some shape or extension in space. Now, if an object is extended in space, it makes sense to ask of it, how big is it? You understand that? So if an object has spatial extension, it is a legitimate question to ask of that object, how big is it? Now, in addition, everything that exists has spatial location. That means that if something exists, it will be located somewhere in space. Now, if something has spatial location, it is appropriate to ask of it, where is it? Not just how big is it, but where is it? Okay? In addition, if something exists, it has to have solidity. Now, solidity is a little bit tough to define, but let's just mean by solidity impenetrability. If something is solid, that means it can't be it's impenetrable. That makes sense to you? Now that's a bit, you can't, that's, by the way, that's just a horrible definition of matter. Anybody tell me why you can't define matter as something that's impenetrable?
Because it exists in free state.
Say it again?
Because it exists in free state.
No.
Which is treated. Because you deny to a person.
Well,
is that what you mean?
Well, but you see there, and the Mormons are right about this. What's happening there would be that there's empty space in the object, and the atoms of the knife are really going between the atoms of the flesh. So nothing's really being penetrated. It's assuming that your skin's got a lot of empty space. Now that won't work. Basically, it's because if you define matter as impenetrable, something impenetrable, the definition is circular. Because it invites the question, impenetrable by what? And you're going to have to say, well, by matter. So if you define matter as impenetrable, you have to turn around and define impenetrable in terms of other pieces of matter, and you end up with a circular definition. You can't say A is defined in terms of B, and if I ask you, well, what the heck's B? And you say, well, B is A. You've got nowhere. Matter is impenetrable. Impenetrable by what? Other matter. So matter turns out to be impenetrable by matter, and it won't work as a definition. Well, that's okay. Just testing it to see where you're at. Okay, so now, for a Mormon, for something to exist requires that the object have spatial location and size of some kind, no matter how small. It's got to be impenetrable and solid, and it's got to be capable of division into further parts. So if an object exists, it's composed of parts. I understand this table fits that. It's got a shape and size, it's got a location, it's solid in a certain sense, and it's composed of parts. Now, God Himself and you are like that. Everything that exists fits those three characteristics. That's what it means to be a materialist, like a Mormon is a materialist. Everything whatsoever is characterized by these features right here. Now, given this, what is the difference between spirit matter and gross matter? Because for Mormons, there is spirit matter, and then there's gross matter. Is this a new term, or are you familiar with this? How many of you, this is new? Okay, few of some of you. Okay, thank you. Spirit matter is finer than gross matter. So what we have is spirit matter and gross matter. And spirit matter is fine-grained. It's so tiny and fine that you can't see it with your eyes. It's too little. Gross matter is more observable. You can see it. Okay? So that's one difference. Another difference is that spirit matter is free, intelligent, and teleological. And I'll explain all these for you as best I can. Gross matter is determined, I'm going to use the word brute. To me, it's not conscious or intelligent. Brute and mechanical. Now let's try to get clear on these terms so we understand a little bit about what this means. When we say that your soul is composed of spirit matter and your body is composed of gross matter. Okay? That's one of the differences. So your soul is a physical object that is composed of spirit matter. God is composed of spirit matter. Okay? So you have a spirit body and a regular body. You have two kinds of bodies. You have a spirit body that's composed of spirit matter, and you have a sense-perceptible body that is composed of gross matter. When you were born, your spirit body was united to a gross body, and when you die, your spirit body leaves your gross body. The spirit body is physical. It is composed of little tiny physical parts. Okay. Now the important point is that an atom of spirit matter is different from an atom of gross matter. You understand how I'm talking to you now? So these are the differences. An atom of spirit matter has free will. It can do it once. It has free choice. It's not, to be candid with you, it's not unfair to think of it as just a little tiny person. You are actually, like the crowd at Arrowhead Stadium or the Rose Bowl. You are literally a conglomeration of a myriad of little centers of consciousness, little persons. That's going to lead to a problem a little bit later, but it's going to have to do with the unity of consciousness. That'll come up in a minute. Gross matter, the stuff that makes this table, is determined according to the laws of nature. Its behavior is determined by scientific law. A little particle of spirit matter, a little spirit atom, has a mind and is conscious. It's got a little mind. It thinks, it has a mental life. An atom of gross matter is just dead, brute, unconscious stuff. Hello? Spirit matter is teleological. That means it can act for a purpose or a goal or an end. It can actually do something for some purpose. That's what it means. The word teleology means happens for a purpose or a goal. Gross matter, it behaves mechanically. It just bumps into each other according to the laws of nature. It doesn't behave purposefully. Chunk of matter just does stuff to other chunks of matter. Okay? But so there is a difference between spirit matter and gross matter.
On spirit matter, we can tell you said that it can act for a purpose or end. Would they hold that it necessarily, that all spirit matter necessarily acts for a purpose?
No, because if it did it necessarily, it wouldn't have free will. If the little atom of spirit matter wants to act for some purpose, it does that. And it turns out that every time you think of something, that's because all the little chunks of spirit matter in you decided to think about the same thing together. That's the unity of your mental life. So when you think about going to lunch, it is literally like everybody at the Kansas City Chiefs football game, all 80,000 people, deciding to get in the same mental state simultaneously. And that's literally, I'm not kidding, that's literally part of the deal here. Okay. So now, there is a difference between spirit matter and gross matter, and everything is ultimately material. Now, why is a little piece of spirit matter still material? Because it's got spatial extension and location. It's divisible into parts. It's composed of further parts. And it's got solidity as a part of it. It's a little chunk of stuff, but it's got consciousness in it. It's a little atom of physical mental stuff. That's the best way I can put it to you. Okay. Now, any questions about this at this point? Yes.
I was just confused as far as if this was a Christian view or the Mormon view.
Well, you need help now. This isn't a Christian view.
Okay, I was making sure because
Yeah.
I've never heard of the little people.
Yeah. Well, right myself, if that never get to know. No, you're on a Christian view. Matters matter, and soul is soul. They actually think that the very concept of soul is a contradiction. They will press a Christian and say, "You tell me what you mean by spirit," and they think it's nonsense. There can't be spirit. Yes, ma'am.
Is it strictly a Mormon view, or is it pretty much materialistic? That's all material. Just this.
That is the Mormon view.
But it is. So people other than Mormons hold to this too, or is it?
No, I don't. I don't know of anybody that holds to the existence of spirit matter. Now, there are materialists that believe everything is made out of gross matter, right? But they don't believe it's spirit matter. So no, as far as I know, I don't know of anybody else that holds to spirit matter. Yes, ma'am.
And this is just Mormon scholarship?
No, this is, well, now I'm not, this is Mormon theology. Now, I don't know, just like not all Christians know their theology, I don't believe all the Mormons you talk to are going to be fully appraised of this, but this is what Mormon Church teaches. So I'm just helping you understand what's back behind this, because in a second, this is going to inform what God is. Okay? Yes?
Is spirit matter capable of undergoing decay?
No. Unless, no, because these are, this is a tough question. Because there's an implicit contradiction in Mormon thought on this. And the contradiction is that if something is further divisible into further parts, it looks like it would be composed of an infinite number of parts. But they believe, a lot of them believe that there are these ultimate little atoms of spirit matter that can't be further divided, so they're eternal. They've always been. So the ultimate little pieces of spirit matter, and I believe the ultimate piece, and the ultimate, because they don't believe in creation out of nothing, the ultimate pieces of gross matter have existed for an infinite past. Yes?
Can they defend this scientifically at all? I mean,
Well, no, but you've got to understand that that doesn't matter. Because the idea that something needs scientific defense before it's rational is itself something that can't be defended scientifically. And I certainly would not want to commit myself to the idea that if I can't defend something scientifically, I can't bring good reasons to bear for it.
right.
One of their arguments for this is that a whole cannot have properties that aren't true of its parts.
Okay.
So,
I was just wondering, since they're basing the whole thing on like one of the fundamentals of physics, you know, or physical science, whether they had any scientific value.
No, they're not really. I think some of this is revealed truth, but also the argument for it is, by the way, I don't believe this either, but that a whole can't have properties that its parts don't have. So if you as a whole object have consciousness, that can only be because all of your parts are conscious. Yes.
Now, I'm just curious, I have two kind of questions. So
Okay.
The first one is, where is this spirit like all over you? According to Mormon theology, is this like all in you, or where is this spirit?
Your spirit is composed of millions of little pieces of spirit matter, and they are all there. They exist in the empty spaces between the chunks of gross matter in your body.
So, in theory, it's all around, like in my body, like
Right. It's side by side the gross matter.
like in between the little gross matter atoms.
That's right.
Now, that second question is like, if you lose an arm, do you have less spirit?
Yes. And that is a huge problem, because then you would become, these are problems with personal identity. So now it seems to be entirely possible for a person literally to be 70% of a person. That's a problem. Furthermore, if you're contemplating a ball game, it's only because all of the spirit atoms in you are doing that. Now let's suppose that the person sitting next to you, half of your spirit atoms decide to start contemplating lunch along with half the spirit atoms in that guy's body. Now you form a new person because half of your spirit atoms are united with half of his spirit atoms, and the unity of a person resides in the fact that all the spirit atoms are in the same simultaneous mental state. So now you would have formed a new person. Are you understanding, or am I over your head on that? Why am I one person? Hold on. Why am I one person? Because all of the tens of thousands of millions of spirit atoms in me have decided to all get into the same mental state at the same time. Now, suppose half of mine just decide to unite with half of yours, then I go out of existence, or something happens and there's a mind meld of some kind. Yes.
I just asked another question popping in my head. Let's say I lost an arm, it fell off for whatever reason. And would the spirit atoms of that arm go to heaven or hell, depending on how I live? Or would they just wait for the rest nearby? Or?
That's a good question.
Is that my question?
I don't know. See, the problem is, here's the problem. On this view, what constitutes a person? At what point do you draw the line as to how many spirit atoms you need to have a person? Why not an arm? I don't know. It's a tough question. And I think that these puzzles demonstrate that there's a really fundamental incoherency about this whole notion. Now, I want to say something now about God, and then I want to try to say something about spirit here. See, on this view, God is a material object. God is physical. Now, what that means is that God is composed of spirit matter. Now, remember, you can't see this kind of matter because it's too fine-grained to be observed. Yes, sir?
Just a real quick question. If they say that you can't see this matter, then how do they account for this division?
Well, it can make itself manifest through other things, but it is not itself visible. But it can make itself manifest, or it could very well be that someone can be given the purity of eyes to see it for a moment. That purity can be taken away. Okay, I'm going to take one more, but then I really do need to kind of. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You asked one earlier.
I was just listening to them. How does spirit matter, gross matter interact?
By way of what's called efficient causality. Just like two chunks of regular matter can interact by exerting forces on one another, the same as since spirit matter is composed of physical stuff as well, it's able to exert a force on each other. Yeah, you're wrong. Okay, now, what does this turn God into? Well, try to follow this line of thinking as best you can here. If something is in space, then it must be in time. The converse doesn't follow. Something could be in time, but not in space. Okay, for example, my thought of lunch is inside time, but it's not located anywhere in space. You can't say my thought of lunch is closer to my left ear or anything like that. So if something is in time, it doesn't follow it's in space. But if something is in space, it follows that it has to be in time, and here's why. Take some object that's in space. If some object is in space, it has to have the ability to move to a different portion of space. But the concept of moving presupposes time. Therefore, if something is in space, given that it has to have the possibility of moving, and moving can't be possible unless there's time, something can't be in space unless it's also temporal. Did you follow the argument here? You want me to say it one more time?
Yeah.
If something is located in space, it has to be possible for that thing to move. You with me? Because it could move to a different point of space. Now, if something is possibly such that it could move, there has to be time, because motion presupposes time. There's no such thing as movement without time. That means a necessary condition for something being in space is that it's temporally located, it's in time. Now, what this proves is that the Mormon God has existed forever. The Mormon God, and indeed the universe, has existed infinitely long. God has been here forever. Okay? Now, He's progressing and improving. You should have this down by now if He's been doing it forever. If the Mormon God is composed of spirit matter, then that God is temporal. It can't be timeless. You can't have a timeless material object. Get a lot of blank stares, so you can't have a timeless material object. If an object is physical, it's got to be temporal. Okay? So the Mormon God must exist inside time. Now there's where the problem is, because if God has existed forever inside time, then that means that God has crossed an actual infinite number of earlier events to come to the present moment. So that means that the Mormon God has endured an infinite number of moments. And this is impossible. Now I'm going to try to show you why it's impossible in a minute. Some of you are familiar with this argument. But the point I want to make right now is that even God on the Christian view can't do this. According to Christian theology, there are a number of things that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob cannot do. He can't create a square circle, for example. And he can't endure an infinite number of moments. Now, this is because without a universe, the Christian view of God is that God exists timelessly without a created universe. So when there is no created world, God is not experiencing a succession of moments. He's not in time. So if you ask me, has God lived forever? My answer is no, he has not. Well, then you say, are you saying that God came into existence? No. God is timeless, at least without creating the universe. So remember, on a Christian view, God himself has not lived throughout an infinite number of moments because the past is finite on a Christian view. But notice that on the Mormon view, the past has got to be infinite. Now that means that if we take the present moment as 0 and we run backwards, and some of you are familiar with this argument, to come to the present moment is like trying to count to 0 from minus infinity. And you can't cross infinity. Nothing can cross infinity. Illustration. Suppose I started counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and I counted forever. So I was up to 50,999 billion, whatever. And you stopped to me and said, what number have you counted? I could give you a finite number that I counted. And no matter how long I counted, I would still be infinitely far away from counting an infinite number of numbers. It doesn't matter how long I counted, I would always still have only counted some growing finite number. And it doesn't matter how big the finite number is, I would be no closer to counting an infinite number of numbers after 50 trillion years than I would after 15 minutes. So, I mean, you suppose I went to heaven and God says you got to count from now on. And you meet some guy who's been counting for 50 trillion years. And I just got 15 seconds, you know, I'm under number 10, and he's at some number that's got 10 to the 49th power decimal. And I could say to him, you know, don't look so snide, you're no closer to being finished than I am, because you can't cross infinity. Now, if you can't go from 0 to positive infinity, you couldn't go from minus infinity to 0 because it's the same length. You with me? Now, here's a good way to use it in evangelism. Trying to cross infinity is like trying to jump out of an infinitely tall pit with a bottom. Try to imagine yourself in a pit with a floor on it and the walls go literally forever. Now remember, it's not like the walls have an edge up there that's infinitely far away. They go literally forever. That's what it means to say the walls are infinite. Now trying to cross infinity is like trying to jump out of that pit. I don't care if you jumped and you had Michael Jordan's old legs. No matter how far you went, you get the point. You would never get out of it. So, you can't cross infinity. That means if God existed forever in time, he could never reach the present moment. Now, there's another point, though, because at least going from 0 to positive infinity, one of the resident I can, blah, 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 blah. I won't get finished, but at least I can get started. Trying to reach 0 from minus infinity not only can't be completed because you can't cross infinity, you can't even get going. This is like trying to jump out of an infinitely tall, bottomless pit. Try to think of trying to jump out of a pit that's infinitely tall that doesn't have a bottom. There would be no place to get your feet planted to get any momentum going. Because if you try to get to the present moment from an infinite past, that's an infinitely long task. But now, what about trying to reach a moment 15 billion years ago? Well, that's an infinite moment. Take any moment of the past. I don't care how long ago it was. To reach that moment, you'd have to cross infinity, and the whole idea of getting going in time is unintelligible. Now, the Christian doesn't mind that because we think back here, there was an initial, guess what, creation event. There was a first moment of time. Unfortunately, that's not available to the Mormons because they believe in an eternal universe and an eternal God, whereby eternal, that means existing in time throughout an infinite past. When Christians say they believe in an eternal God, they mean a timeless God. Not a God who has existed in time throughout an eternal past. A being who existed in time throughout an infinite past is impossible, as this argument shows. And so this, folks, this is a deep incoherence in the Mormon concept of God. And it is a problem that simply will not go away. Because if God has a body, He's got to be in time, which they grant. And since He never came to be, He has to have endured an infinite past to reach the present, which is impossible. It's like jumping out of an infinitely tall bottomless pit. Just remember that. Which is impossible on both grounds. You couldn't cross if you could get going, and you can't even get going. So it's doubly damned. Doubly difficult. Okay. Now that's the nature of the Mormon God as an embodied figure. As an embodied figure. Now there are all kinds of other problems with the Mormon concept of God. Now let me give you one other problem with the Mormon concept of God. Then I want to try to define a spirit for you, and then I think I'll at least have done something for you this evening. My first problem with the Mormon doctrine of God as an embodied object composed of spirit matter is that being could not have endured an infinite past. That's incoherent. That's my first problem. My second problem is that such a being could not be present in more than one place at the same time. Now let's think about this. How is an object related to space that is described in these categories? Suppose you've got an object that is spatially extended and located in solid. Let's take, for example, this podium. Would you agree with me that this is a material object? For our purposes, stay with me. It doesn't matter if it's composed of gross matter or spirit matter. Now, in this case, it's composed of gross matter. Now I'm really lost. But we don't worry about that right now. The point is that would you agree with